Then we will have Herman Rosenfeld, who will replace Anna Lermer, who couldn't make it today. Herman is with the Socialist Project as well as with the Free Transit Toronto Project, and he's been working a lot over the last few years with the TTCriders themselves. So he'll be talking significantly about the TTCriders campaign on the subway issue and other matters.
I'm speaking here for TTCriders. Interesting enough, Daniel's working with TTCriders here. He's got the TTCriders t-shirts, and I have about 10 or 15 bags of TTCriders t-shirts in my bag. I should have worn one tonight, but I didn't. But I'm going to talk a little bit about what TTCriders is doing, partly around this campaign and partly around other things, because they're tied. A lot of this is tied together, and it isn't all that different from what other people have talked about. I won't repeat it. The TTCriders has played an important role in a lot of the resistance to the uploading of the subway, but we've also sought to continue working in a number of areas affecting the TTC transit users, which interact with that. Of course, the challenge of having an extremist Ford regime, and they are pretty extreme, control one of the components of what's now the TTC, is a central issue right at the moment, and it provides a way of understanding not only what is wrong with the provincial ownership of the key element of Toronto's transit picture, but also clues to a more integrated regional vision might look like, or some of this, at least how we can contribute to it in a different way. TTCriders are centrally concerned with three components of public transit: accessibility of public transit for all those who need it, and the people who really depend upon public transit for everything are often people of lower incomes, working class people, people of color, people in different communities, as part of a necessary move for equality, fairness, and environmental sustainability. Second, affordability of using transit, which is integrated to that, obviously. And thirdly, maintaining some kind of democratic control over the operation, investment, maintenance, and planning of public transit. I say maintaining because we don't really have a lot. I mean, increasing or actually introducing in some of those areas. For now, we're engaged in a set of scenarios which are defensive on almost all of these fronts, but we're also fighting to move forward. One of the issues we always raise in every one of these, they say, well, uploading will mean the provincial government will be able to pay for things, aside from the fact that this provincial government won't pay for things. They're looking to cut things or privatize things, is the fact that they could pay for it now. They could have paid for it last year. The Wing government could have paid for it. They didn't. We're committed to always calling for dramatically increasing funding from both the city and the province. With all the smoke and mirrors, this remains a central truth, a central demand in all of this. Public transit will never be able to provide the necessary buses, LRTs, subways, streetcars, maintain them, or what have you, to provide real and on-the-ground services people need without steady increased funding for operations and capital costs. The fact is that train travel and public transit costs money. And as was said before, the public is the subsidizing is a bad word. The fact that the public sector, government's paying for public transit, the percentage they pay for is the lowest anywhere in North America. That means the fare box is what people pay for. And a lot of the conservative politicians, they love that. This is something they brag about. It's something to be proud of, like the Denzel Menenwongs and those people. But that's something that obviously needs to change. We're discussing with the regular overcrowding, lack of regular and frequent bus service, the refusal to fund and build LRTs where they're needed, or for more subways where required. We're involved in sustaining the King streetcar experiment. I look to have it repeated elsewhere. This is where we're basically moving towards reducing car traffic and relying more on basically squeezing them out and having above ground streetcars there. And we're also been a key voice in pushing for this so-called relief line to be built. We have called for less reliance on the fare box and lowering fares for both average users and seniors and low-income people. And one component of the demands that we have has been that people who are on social assistance should ride free, like kids right now do nominally, at least without these cars they have to get, and we want to move in that direction. But also considering necessary forms of regional integration, we have consistently called for maintaining TTC level fares while lowering them instead of a fare by distance or differential fares by speed, as Daniel was talking about. You know, there's a big kerfuffle now about fare evasion. What is it, 63 million they say they're losing because of fare evasion. Well, if fares were lower, and they didn't waste the way they've operated with the Presto cards, then perhaps, and if the relative importance of fares to paying for transit wasn't so high, then this wouldn't be such of a big deal. Instead, they look at how many people are going to hire to try and punish or police people, and you know who gets policed and how they get policed. You don't need a genius to figure that out. And part of this has been fighting for funding tools, both the city and the province, new progressive taxes, raising property taxes, and you know there's another study now from Ryerson about how low property taxes really are in Toronto, and there's ways to protect certain vulnerable people around them. And finally, fighting to keep it public, we also oppose the P3 nature of Metrolinx projects, almost all of them by including from the federal government and the provincial government and the Liberals before the current Conservatives. Infrastructure Ontario always had its principal thing, you've got to be a P3. And we want it organized for fully public and including maintaining and expanding planning capacities in governments, not outsourced to private corporations like SNC Lavalin, maybe, as well as arguing for bringing ordinary transit users into the process. The current environment with Ford's commitment to subways presents some interesting challenges. I'll just go through them briefly, many of which were mentioned by Deborah and Dania, but I want to touch on them a little bit differently. This is not the way to increase levels of necessary regional or intercity coordination, which is a positive way to go. But Metrolinx, which is the provincial authority which has supposedly coordinated this, has always been seen as a P3 orientation. Its membership has been of ex-politicians, some experts, but ex-politicians, almost all of whom were conservative, including Janet Ecker, who was the finance minister in the Harris government, looks to take away the city's capacity to orient our transit future towards Toronto's neighborhoods and employment patterns. Having the subways integrated with other modes allows today Torontonians to have a potential to address the travel needs of average working people in the city, moving from car dependence to public transit, cycling, whatever, all other forms of environmentally friendly transit dependence. The province is not a center to impose regional authority, as when New York City's subways was taken over. Basically the state government saw this as a bank. They used it to fund all kinds of nonsense, and now they're paying the price. And interestingly enough, the person in charge of having to deal with this issue is a guy that used to be in charge of the transit here. I sort of feel sorry for the guy to be in that situation, but you never know. What they are trying to do, obviously, is to move for P3s, potential privatization of big chunks, even of the subway system, you never know. Veer towards the needs of outer suburban elites, dominance of the car, which is also a critical component, and the needs of networks of working people and people on lower incomes will be ignored. Any kind of regional coordination would require, if it's going to be fair and it's going to move in the direction where we all would like to see it go, require democratic representation from transit users, elected representatives, as well as planners, and a cooperative body, not a body which has imposed certain ideological orientation from a conservative government. But basically some kind of cooperative effort. There's nothing wrong with regional coordination. And in the battle for public opinion, often this uploading is being sold as a way of, oh, so this is a step towards some regional coordination. Well, it's a step towards something else. But there's nothing wrong with the regional coordination, and as Stefan said in his original presentation, there's nothing to celebrate in not having some kind of larger coordinated issue. I guess I just want to finish by saying that we are part of the current campaigns against the uploading. And one of the things that we are trying to do, and we had mixed success, is trying to build bases in different communities, geographical communities around Toronto. Because we're sort of like, we do three different things. One is that we speak on policy, and we lobby politicians, we organize protests against, to make certain things happen. And when something goes on, they ask TTCriders, and we have comments. And secondly is that we try to mobilize our natural supporters, people who use public transit. And a lot of the way we reach those people is as Deborah was saying, is through just getting individuals, which is not the most effective way to do things. But the third thing we try to do is build in different communities. What does a public transit movement look like that has links to critical communities, that is there? It's something that we're still trying to figure out, because the public transit, TTCriders is about 6 years old. I remember when we first started it out as a real movement. And we've always been vexed by this. I'll just finish, and you can sign up for stuff for TTCriders, but also Free Transit Toronto, and there's a lot of other kinds of books there. Thanks a lot.
And then we'll have Roger Keil, who's a colleague of mine in the Faculty of Environmental Studies at York University. He's research chair in global suburban studies at York. He researches global suburbanization, urban political ecology, cities, and infectious disease, and regional governance. And he's a principal investigator of a major collaborative research initiative on global suburbanism, which is still ongoing, but about to finish later this year.
So I don't have much of a voice left. Haven't had one for the last 2 days, which may have had something to do with the fact of what I was going to tell you first, which is that only 5 days ago, for reasons that have to do with my family living, some of my family living in Switzerland, I was in a small village up in the mountains, about 2,400 meters up in the mountains. And there's a bus there every half hour that comes right on the minute at which you would expect that bus to come. It goes down these terrible looping mountain roads. And then it goes down to a train station at the bottom of the hill, about 10 minutes, 15 minutes later. And lo and behold, there is a train there, in an underground station, in a mountain valley. You get on that train takes you down another winding stretch until you go to the main valley in Vallis. And then you get on a train in a town called Martigny, which takes you again to wherever you want to go. I happened to go on that day from that little village up in the mountains to Amsterdam. And then I went to Paris, and I took the subway, and I paid €3 to get from Gare de Lyon to Gare du Nord. And I got on another train, and went through Brussels, and to Antwerp, and to Rotterdam, and then I arrived in Amsterdam. And I had luggage, right? Wow. And then I thought, that's kind of crazy, because I know exactly what I would expect when I arrived in Toronto, which was exactly the opposite. Yeah. Nothing would work, and we'd have no mountains. So I looked, and I actually had pictures of my trip here, but we have no projection, which is why I have it here on the computer too. I then took it upon me to quickly look at numbers, because people say, well, it's unfair, Switzerland is a country, right? And I'll look at the numbers. So Switzerland has 8.5 million people. We in the GTHA have 6.5 million people, growing rapidly, right? And people say, well, you know, the Europeans, they have density, we don't have density. We can't afford this kind of thing. So Switzerland has a density of 212 Swiss people per square kilometer. And remember, they have a lot of mountains and deep, deep valleys. Does anybody know how the density is of the GTHA? It's 844 people. It's 4 times more than Switzerland does. The area of Switzerland, of course, is 5 times larger than the GTHA, but about the same amount of people. 30%, and this is where it becomes a little dodgy, because we don't really know what people do when they use transit, but about 30% of people in Switzerland, in the country of Switzerland, use public transit. Here at the GTHA, actually this is the number, is for the GTA, it's census number, so I actually think it's a census area, so I'm not so quite sure. I didn't have the time to look it up. but it's roughly 23% of us using. And it's dodgy because transit, as my predecessors have pointed out, it's not just for getting to work, but it's one way to look at it. But transit is something that should be there so that I can use it on a Sunday morning going to Amsterdam, right? Okay, so that's one way to look at it. We are badly underserved, and the country of Switzerland and all its communities, its cantons, its cities and its villages are making a public commitment, and the people in Switzerland, including the tourists like me, are making a commitment to use the many, many options that exist in that country, which is in the center of Europe and has many boundaries and has to have many compatibility issues to be worked out. And you know, I crossed 5 borders on that trip, right? So people have to coordinate these things. We talk about governance. We can't even coordinate a region. And here I'm going through all of Europe and I don't even have to change seats. So there's something is completely out of whack. So before we even have a conversation about what Ford does to our precious subway, let's look at what we don't have. Now I'm using that subway. And here's another problem. I use that subway almost daily because I go to work at York and I live in the East End, right? So there's a similarity. There's something that my left-wing downtown friends share with Richard Florida. There's only one thing they share with Richard Florida. Maybe a few more. Love for bicycles or whatever. They share with him his hate for the York subway. Every time I sit with unnamed councillors who I consider my friend and talk about the York subway, they get really upset. They think it shouldn't exist. Right? So I call that arrogance in or to the core. Right? It's arrogance in the core for what they think they should have to move themselves around when they live somewhere south of St. Clair. And an arrogance, of course, to the core because it's at the bottom of some of the transit decisions that have been made in this region for the past 50, 70, 100 years, which is to serve the core. Right? And that's a problem because there's so many people not being served. Now I'm happy that after 27 years of working at York, I finally have the damn subway. Actually, Herman and I, we met at York, and the time when we did this course together in the summer of 1992, the buses were often half an hour apart at York. I don't even know how we survived that.
A lot of the buses, a lot of studying on the buses, I'll tell you.
And
studying on the bus.
That's terrible. So, and the question here for me is why in a modern urban region like Toronto, we're not a small village in Switzerland, we're a modern big metropolitan region, why shouldn't a student, 60,000 of them, have the right to have a subway? I asked Richard Florida that question on Twitter. Because the point, what he said, I didn't read that to you. Richard Florida. He said, Toronto is spending billions on trains to tennis stadiums. So I reminded him of Twitter that there were 60,000 students up at York. Anyway, so it's important to keep these things in perspective. Scale, size, need, the constituencies of people that actually need that kind of transit, and all that. Right? It's very important to keep that in sort of some sort of when we talk about what Ford does to us, we need to think about all these things. We also need to pay attention to the fact that a lot of the things that we believe is at the basis of decisions, why subways or streetcars or buses are being put into use, has nothing to do with what we think are the reasons for those decisions. The majority of transportation decisions in this province or anywhere else is made to move goods around, right? You've heard of the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. If we were anywhere close to it, it would affect us too. It affects everything in the world now. These kinds of decisions that are made by big corporations in cahoots with big government at a multi-regional stage, and before you even put your foot on a bus, on a local bus, all the roads are already taken up by the trucks and the trains that move that stuff around, that they then drone to you from Amazon, right? So this is the background to all of this. We pretend that we actually have a decision-making power. I think we should have, but we don't, right? Because the roads have already been planned for, who's going to be on these roads and all those kinds of things. So let me give you just one current example. So this came around yesterday, which I actually hadn't seen in that stark list, and I can't show it to you, but I'll turn it around. So between 2000 and 2018, in the downtown of Toronto, that's now classical 416905, and anybody asks, right? 13 million square feet of office was built in downtown Toronto. At the same time, twice as much was built in the suburbs, the 905. Between 2000 and 2018. Under construction, in the fourth quarter of 2018, the quarter that just ended, there were 10 million square feet in the downtown and only 1.3, a tenth of it, in the suburbs. So the relationship has been completely inverted, right? So jobs or buildings for office jobs are being created, are being built in the downtown now, not in the suburbs. And the projection gets even worse if, well, that's that. But the vacancy rate in the suburbs adds to it because it's 10% as opposed to 1% in the downtown. Now, this is a very grave aspect of the conversation we need to have. This has to do with decisions being made about investment into transit and transportation generally. Don't forget about autonomous cars and all those things that are really being pushed right now. People don't want transit anymore. It's already on its way out. People want, autonomous cars. People, when I say people, the people who make the transit decisions, the big corporations. Yesterday, BMW and Mercedes-Benz started to cooperate on autonomous cars. These are the biggest corporations in the world. They are making these decisions, right? Oh, by the way, I forgot to say that Bombardier is also in trouble in Switzerland for not delivering any train. So if we take all of that into account, we're facing a tremendous problem just in Toronto. And that problem is that we are creating millions of square feet of office space in a super consolidated, super concentrated downtown space. The majority of these workers will not be able to afford to live downtown. Right? And that adds to the fact that, as Pamela Bley and the Neptis Foundation have found out, that we already have grossly underserved suburban employment zones that they call knowledge-intensive districts at York University around the airport, where you have tens of thousands of people working, going there every day, but there's no functional public transit. So this is a catastrophic scenario. So if we consider that as the background, the actual background of the decisions that have to be made if we want to move beyond 4, then we really have a task cut out for ourselves. And that task is, of course, one of societal transformation, an urban transformation that we haven't seen in this region, perhaps ever, which is that we're already seeing the underserved suburban areas, then also suffering in the future from being cut off from those job-rich areas downtown. And when I say jobs, of course, we all know, and this has already been said, is that, let's say, 70% of those jobs in these offices are well-paying jobs, good-paying jobs. 30% maybe are not. These are the people who clean the offices. These are the people who make the food. These are the people who deal with the mail and all this, right? Those people have no chance in hell to live anywhere close to those newly constructed office buildings, right? So we have a societal problem on our hands. So this transit is only one aspect of larger urban restructurings that we need to keep our eyes on. And I think I'll leave it at that, what, 10 minutes? Yeah. And we can come back to that.
Last but not least is Tricia Wood, another colleague of mine, but in the Department of Geography at York University, co-founder of the City Institute at York University, and frequent columnist, urban affairs and transit columnist for spacing.ca. Again, something to check out later.
Hi, I hope I'm hoping there's still a few things left to say after everybody's comments. I think I'm going to put my Code Red TO hat on. I'm a member of Code Red TO and one of the authors of a report that we put out that's been cited here this evening, the work, which is awesome, about the funding. We put this out last November, and what we looked at was Toronto in a North American, well, Canada, United States context, and we compared kind of how Toronto was doing, strengths and weaknesses, along the lines of fares, networks, budgets, and governance. And I want to talk mainly about the governance part, which I did the research for. Because to return to the New York example, which is an important kind of cautionary tale for us, New York actually technically still owns its subways. But when they were rescued in the 1960s by the state, a lease arrangement was created. And so one of the points about this is to kind of focus our attention on what it is we need to be focusing our attention on, and not let the ownership stuff become sort of the only thing, and the funding become the only thing we're talking about, because it is these questions about who's making these decisions, as Roger was pointing to as well. And what we need to change, kind of why we're in the vulnerable position that we are as well. Because one of the things I notice about as this has been kind of brought to our door is that there's nowhere we can automatically turn, right? There's no sense that the mayor's office or city hall is championing, a response, just as it didn't really with Bill 5 either. So again, I would echo, the role of civil society is really important in terms of pushing it, but it points to a vacuum that we already have that kind of puts us partly in this position. So what has happened in New York, which is one of the things that we do need to be worried about, is the diversion of funds that's been mentioned and the lack of investment. I think there's actually a good deal of consensus among people who are on either side of this issue that the problem isn't the order of government, right? That by moving the ownership from the city to the province is going to solve something. It really is, do we have a new plan or arrangement for making decisions that takes especially the thumb off the scale of those decisions so that they are more evidence-based? Do we have an arrangement that puts funding into place for operations, and do we have a new arrangement for funding capital expansion? Because on all fronts, Toronto is unusual in North America. If you've ever had that sense that we seem to be particularly vulnerable to politicization, you're right. Our governance bodies, both the TTC and Metrolinx especially, are particularly vulnerable on that front. And if you have a sense that our funding is less than it should be, absolutely. If you have a sense that there is a much lesser role of both, in that case, the provincial and the federal government in operations and capital expansion, you're absolutely right. We probably have the least subsidized system actually in the world in terms of Western democracies. Just by having it in North America, that kind of puts us in the running for the world, for public systems. So what I want to kind of talk about is how we should prioritize governance over ownership, which is not to remove ownership from the conversation at all, but to really dig down a little bit deeper into why governance matters. Because as I said, the question is not just who pays, right, but who decides. And I think we also want to stop thinking so either or. We are being asked to think in an either or kind of way, right? This conversation was not brought to the city of Toronto in the sense of, hey, let's talk about how we can do this better. This conversation was brought to us as a fight. We're taking it over. We're not really giving you a say. Right? That's not a conversation. So one of the things that civil society can try to do is force that conversation and make it more of a public conversation. One of the things that's really interesting, of course, is that what we're experiencing now is linked to Bill 5, that when we look to other cities that have strong transit systems, especially have strong regional, integration, those kinds of systems, they are also cities that have strong municipal regional governments, right? Which we don't have, and obviously Bill 5 was a step in the other direction. And those are connected just as they were, for example, when Thatcher did something similar to London, right? They uploaded London transportation the year before they demolished the regional London government. So they're absolutely connected. But one of the things I think that we can do to kind of counter some of what's happening is to be putting other ideas out there about what we want. So not just about resisting and defending, though we should continue to do that, but also put better ideas out there, because our transit governance structure is weak and could be improved. I think the proposal would make it worse. So I think we should put proposals out there about what we could do. We want to think about, obviously, a stronger municipal government generally, but when it comes specifically to transit governance, I think we want to think about better representation, fairer representation, in terms of both their governance boards and their processes. I think we want to think about diversity and equity, because those are essential. This is some of what Roger is getting at, to really push towards a different way of thinking about transit, right, in terms of it being something that everyone should expect in every quarter of it. And one of the things that I think Toronto needs to play a role in particular is really advocating what Toronto gets right. Because one of the things that we discovered is, even though Toronto is weak in some ways, it has the second highest ridership in Canada and the United States. We're second only to New York. We spend about the same amount of money as Chicago, and we're about the same size cities in terms of population and scale. But we move twice as many people, and they have twice the network. So we have some real strengths, but more importantly than that, I mean, yay us against Chicago, right? But even more importantly than that, and this gets at something that Roger was talking about with those numbers, in this region of the GTHA, there is only one place that's getting it right. In the very urgent need to get people out of their cars and either walking, cycling, or on transit, it is only Toronto that is moving the needle. It is only Toronto that has that in a good way. In terms of daily tasks, including commuting, but other things, right? In Toronto, about half of us drive to do that. In all of the other municipalities around us in the GTHA, it's 80% or higher. In Burlington, 86% of people drive to work every day. And I have some of the numbers for the GTHA. I don't have them from the GTA, but from the Metrolinx plan, right, which is the plan for this whole region. They have this transportation plan that goes out for 25 years to 2041. And their goal is to move the needle from 14.2% of that entire region using transit to 14.7. In 25 years, if the entire plan is implemented. Now, there's a lot of good stuff in that plan, right? But there isn't obviously enough. And if we want to talk about how do we move the whole region, the place we need to be looking at is Toronto. So Toronto has to take the lead in that conversation, but in a positive way, right? And I think that's possible. I think it also needs to move beyond, I mean, it doesn't have to all be centered on Toronto as a destination. It needs to move beyond that. And that's where I think Toronto might offer some assistance if everybody were at the same table, which I'm going to get to. Because another thing that always strikes me about the region and what Roger was saying, comparing us to Switzerland, is when I look at the map of where rail connections are and I look at the distribution of the population throughout this region, we have two very large other cities in this region. Toronto obviously is huge, and then everyone else is smaller, but we shouldn't overlook how big some of those are anyway. Brampton, Mississauga, 600,000 and 700,000. Their city centers are 20 kilometers apart. I have yet to find another two comparable cities at that distance and that size, honestly, anywhere else in the Western world that do not have regular rail service. But there's nothing between them. We might get LRT, but we have to get Brampton back to the table to make the connection up here, Ontario. Right, so the problem isn't all about getting everybody to Toronto. The regional movement, as Roger was pointing to, is much more complex than that, right? And we need to be thinking about better connections, throughout the constellation. But again, it's Toronto that has the model. It's Toronto that has the experience. It's Toronto that has successfully deployed really good service in suburban areas that have high ridership. Some of the highest bus ridership in the city is not in the downtown core. It's on Eglinton and Dufferin and Lawrence and Shepherd and Finch. Right? So that's some of the heaviest ridership, and the reason why in places that in the United States and comparable cities you would never have that kind of ridership because you wouldn't have that kind of service. Right? We have done some things very well, and that's why we have the ridership that we do. And those are some of the lessons we can bring, but we don't have a governance model to get us there. What we have at the moment is a TTC board of commissioners that technically is an independent agency, but effectively operates as a committee of council. It's run, the chair is basically appointed by the mayor, right? That's is an elected councillor, and the majority of other members are also elected councillors. They're approved by council, but they're effectively appointed by the mayor. So basically, if the mayor wants to, and generally the mayor does, he can set the agenda for the transit agency, right? I can't find another agency that functions like that at the municipal level in Canada, the United States. They're not set up that way. Which is not to say that cities don't have a voice, but it's not the same elected officials running, like there is still their independence. There's another thing that gives them independence, which I'll come back to in a minute. Metrolinx is even worse, of course. It's appointed in council by the premier. It isn't even, rubber stamped by the legislature. And it used to have elected officials, but when they actually started asking for things, they kicked them off. And now the only criteria for being on the Metrolinx board is that you not be an elected official. There's also sort of talk about you should have some business management experience and so on, but there's no system to screen for that. Other places actually screen for that. So I want to move towards just to give you a few other ideas from some of the research, very briefly, about what other cities do that could put some things into place and what we might think about. To go back to Chicago, Chicago has the CTA, has a city agency, and it has PACE, which is a separate thing, but it has a commuter rail agency as well, and then above those is a regional agency that coordinates it. So they put the regional agency in place without getting rid of the other ones, right? And all of them have shared boards. Nobody runs either one. The state funds these are all state-created agencies. That's usually the way that it works, right? But what matters is who's on the board making the decisions. And one of the things that I like about Chicago's model is that on all these boards, like take the CTA board, the governor appoints some people to that board, and the city appoints some people to that board, and they have to approve each other's choices. Right? So nobody's going to run the table because if you do, then I will. And it's not to say that this depoliticizes things. I mean, certainly not in Chicago. But it does take some of it. It makes it a little bit more indirect, and it encourages cooperation. Right? You keep the politics and maybe remove a little bit of the partisan interference, which is a different kind of politicization. In Philadelphia, they have a regional system that people are actually not very satisfied with in terms of its representation. But one of the things that they have done to counter it, like Philadelphia only has 2 representatives on it, and then every other municipality in the region has 1, so they're outvoted. But those 2 reps from Philadelphia can veto anything that the board puts forward, and in order to override that veto within a month, 75% of the entire board has to overrule it. So that they can't, I mean, they still do very well, Philadelphia a little bit, but they do, but it gives them a little bit more of what you actually kind of have in Vancouver in some ways too. And the other thing that they have in terms of the representatives on the board that are appointed by the state legislature is that they have a majority leader appointment and a minority leader appointment. So that would be like if we had 2 appointments from the province on the TTC board, for example, it would be like the premier appointed one and the leader of the opposition appointed one. And it's just to give you, I mean, I'm not saying that any of these are models, but when you start looking at other governance structures and you realize, first of all, how much more common it is for them to be shared, to have representatives from various levels of government, which makes sense if we want and should want and expect, for example, the province to be funding, they should be at the table as part of the planning conversation, right? But that's actually the norm, and when you start looking at all these organizations, you realize there are all kinds of ways of improving the representation. In Vancouver, as I mentioned, they have a regional agency that looks after the whole region, and it includes not only a board of governors, but a mayor's council, where you can also, if you ask, and this happened recently, have a vote that is weighted by population. again, so that, you know, sort of outlying areas can't override high populations. It got played recently in an interesting way. The other thing that Vancouver has, though, that's really good is it has a screening panel. So they have criteria for sitting on the Board of Governors, and everybody gets their opportunity, the cities, the province, to put in their nominations, but a screening panel of 5 independent, I think it's 5 independent people, vet those, and then only people who have been independently vetted can go forward. And if you look at who's on Vancouver's Board of Governors, it's the kind of people you would want on Board of Governors, the people with very good, relevant experience and a lot of independence. The last one I want to mention is Montreal, because Montreal has a very complicated governance structure because, of course, it amalgamated and then de-amalgamated, and it has kind of remnants of that history in terms of, it's got probably more levels of governance than you would put in if you were starting from scratch. But one of the things that Montreal has that's really strong is
neighborhood mayors and city councilors.
It has all kinds of cross-representation from all the different regions and stakeholders geographically, and it has transit user representative and paratransit user representatives, and one of them has to be under 35. So they actually make sure that users are on the Board of Governors. I mean, I think we have 2 boards right now where a minority of people actually, right, use the transit that they're responsible for. The other piece that all of these agencies have that we don't, with the exception, again, sadly, of Montreal, is they have dedicated gas or sales tax that is goes directly to transit, and it is the agency that has the authority to decide how it's spent. And it's not a little bit of money. The smallest one brings in $500 million every single year dedicated to transit. That kind of dedicated, predictable funding also gives these agencies some political independence, because they are not reliant, you know, year after year to go hat in hand saying, well, we want money for operations, we want money to, you know, for the incredible state of good repair backlog, and yes, New York's is even worse, and so on, because investment's not going to come with this, but this kind of independence can improve governance as well. Just to put it in comparison, the toll proposal that Tory put forward, which was sort of a big deal in this town, was projected to bring in about $200 million a year, and it wasn't all dedicated to transit, it was going to be shared. So even though that was a big deal for this city, it was really small potatoes for what's out there. I think LA brings in $1.5 billion in dedicated funding through taxes. So yeah, that's sort of the order of things that we should be thinking about, and that would contribute to better transit. I do think that we should, let me put it this way, I don't think that we are currently being invited to have this kind of conversation, where we actually talk about substantive specific ideas about how we might reform governance, put a better funding model in place, and so on. But I think that with the pressure of civil society and people like the people who are on this panel, we could publicly have that conversation, and that's what I really hope that we will do. And if our report helps with that, all the better. Thanks very much.